Episode 29, Welcome to Isle Delfino. It was a dark night over the blooper ocean. The clouds were dark and angry, and wind ripped through the air, churning up the seas like a blender. The Koopa battleship Terrapin moved through the sky, the wind blowing at its banners and threatening to rip them apart. Terrapin was a ship in the navy of Princess Wendy, displaying the colors of Bowser's only female child, which were drenched in the rain. Captain Cupid slouched on his command chair on the Terrapin's bridge, his eyes closed. Around him the storm rumbled. The repetitive beeping of the various control consoles on the bridge was lulling him to sleep. Cupid did not like to work late-night patrols, especially not on nights like this. He far preferred to spend these hours at the Delfino Plaza bars, picking up beautiful ladies who were charmed by the mere fact of having an officer flirt with them. He did not like these routine patrols of the seas of Sector 3, in which nothing ever happened. Both the Kongs and the Kremlings had been put down in the first years of the Emperor's conquest. The Snowmads had been completely wiped out when they had attempted to raid Neo Bowser City back in the homeland. An action that had earned one Koopa by the name of Fort Uga's Flame. A spot on Koopa High Command. Because of that, Sector 3 was almost completely safe. Koopa outposts were occasionally raided by the ghostly Captain Cortez, one of the few allies of Mario still active, but the military had long learned that the Black Skull was untraceable by technology. Even if he was right below the Terrapin right now, it wouldn't do any good. Besides, it wasn't like the pirate posed a major threat to Imperial stability anyway. Cupid yawned, thinking about his warm bed back in the officers' quarters in Wendy's palace. Outside, the rain pattered relentlessly on the bridge's roof. Sometimes, being a member of the invincible Koopa troop could be so dull.
Captain Cupid, sir,
came a voice from the bridge.
We've picked up something on our radar.
Cupid opened his eyes, blinking them a few times to clear his vision. The speaker, a green-shelled Koopa sitting at one of the radar stations, looked concerned.
What's all the fuss about?
Cupid sighed, straightening his military coat and walking across the wooden planks to the Koopa.
It's a ship, sir,
the Koopa said, pointing to the screen before him.
It's certainly not one of ours. Could be a plane.
Cupid shrugged.
That's nothing too unusual. It's much bigger than a plane, sir,
the Koopa replied, his eyes nervously darting back to the screen.
According to our radar, it's larger than the Terrapin.
Cupid bit his lip nervously. There weren't a lot of aircraft larger than a Koopa troop warship, and any that existed certainly had no business around Sector 3. Great. Looks like he was going to have to do some work, after all.
Send a communication request,
Cupid ordered one of the crew members. The shy guy hurriedly pressed a few buttons at his panel.
Can't get through to them, Captain. They've denied all communication request. It's coming closer,
another Koopa from across the bridge shouted, pressing a button on her control console.
Captain, I have a visual.
Cupid strode to the center of the room and looked at the holographic screen that had popped up before him, displaying footage from the ship's cameras. It was a huge, sleek, and silver ship, with two massive spurs sticking out of the front. It almost reminded Cupid of an outlet plug in shape, only instead of being square and boxy, everything was smooth, rounded, and futuristic looking. White lights shone from the ship, lighting up the dark night around them. It was getting closer. Cupid crossed his arms. What to do, what to do? There was no Koopa Troop logo on it anywhere, not from any of the sectors. That just about ruled out it being a secret project. Subtlety and the Koopa Troop had never gone hand in hand. Was it an enemy ship? Impossible. Fire Flower didn't have these kind of resources. He would have been informed if they had. The ship continued to come forward, coming up right behind the terrapin so that it was right between its spurs, almost as if it was caught in a claw. They were so close Cupid could see the shining silver spurs, with their blinking white lights, through the main window. The rest of the bridge crew looked around nervously.
Try hailing again,"
Cupid ordered. He wasn't quite sure what else to do.
"Captain,"
came the voice of a Goomba, shrill with fear.
They're charging up their weapons. It's a massive gun. Much bigger than anything we have."
"What?" Cupid exclaimed, as the bridge was flooded with blue light. A blinding flash lit up the skies above Blooper Ocean. When it faded away, the silver-colored ship slipped away into the shadows of the clouds. The few timbers of the terrapin that remained splashed into the water, swallowed up in an instant by the waves. The members of Koopa High Command sat around the council table, their faces sullen. Several of the seats were empty, not just because of the defectors, but because many of them were fighting on the front lines. Most of the Koopa Empire's top generals had not seen a fight since the Metro Kingdom had been subjugated. Guerrilla tactics by Fire Flower were nothing like this. Grand General Sheldon tapped his fingers nervously on the table's shiny black surface as he stared at the faces of his associates. He had bad news to bring. Dark days were certainly approaching for the Empire, and with Emperor Bowser in his current state of mind, they couldn't have come at a worse date.
"I'd like to begin this meeting by giving you all an update on the war,"
Sheldon said seriously, bringing up a holographic world map.
"The enemy's superior military is proving difficult to handle. Without the Emperor's permission, the Koopa Central Forces cannot participate in the war, which leaves the armies of Bowser Jr., Morton, Iggy, and Lemmy on our side. Princess Wendy is expected to side with whichever side seems most profitable. She's currently neutral."
The other generals nodded.
"That leaves 4 of our armies up against 3 of theirs,"
a red-shelled Koopa with a military hat commented.
"We have the outnumbered." "No, General Spark Shell,"
Sheldon replied.
"The fact is, out of all of our armies, only Prince Bowser Jr.'s is able to match any of the rebels. This
Neo Empire,
as they are calling themselves. Princes Morton, Iggy, and Lemmy never put much thought into our armies. Most of Prince Bowser Jr.'s forces are concentrated in Sector 2, as such, we are putting up a good defense there and they have made little headway. In Sector 5, however, things look grim."
The Mushroom World map lit up, showing which areas were controlled by which side.
"By my mustache!"
King Bob-omb exclaimed.
"That's nearly a fifth of Prince Iggy's land. Impossible." "Unfortunately, it is very possible,"
Sheldon replied darkly.
"Prince Ludwig has developed new war machines that are cutting through our army. Unless we receive permission from the Emperor to send in the Koopa Central Fleet, it's likely it will be lost."
There was a grim silence around the table. Nobody wanted to think about what would happen if the Koopa Empire lost an entire sector. They all knew the 3 princes who led the Neo Empire. They were brutal and tenacious, unlikely to give up their territory even if they lost the war. Even if the Koopa Empire managed to keep Bowser and his chosen heir on the throne, all territory they lost while doing so would remain an enemy, a rival nation that would be sure to trouble them years to come.
"Additionally, the enemy is pushing back Prince Lemmy's army in Sector 6.
Sheldon continued.
"Progress is slower as they do not have Ludwig's new weapons, but the relative weakness of Lemmy's army makes fighting back a challenge. You know, I was hoping we'd get a break from being taken over,"
General Goomp complained, leaping up and down on his chair in frustration.
"First that Count Bleck loser, then that Fawful maniac, and now even the princes are trying kick Emperor Bowser out? Isn't this getting old?
Sheldon closed his eyes. He hadn't told his companions the worst of the news yet. It was news that had shaken him, made him even more nervous than Ludwig's new weapons that cut through his ships like butter.
I'm afraid there is one more thing you all must know,
he said, his eyes still closed.
I recently received a direct communication from Prince Bowser Jr., relaying an urgent message from a member of the Mushroom City garrison. Mushroom City has fallen. Impossible!
Came the loud voice of General Flame, on Sheldon's far left. The Fire Bro had stood up, his blue eyes wild.
I am in total control of the Mushroom Kingdom. Just because I left Mushroom City for a few days to go to these stupid meetings doesn't mean that the city can fall. Oh, it can, General Flame.
Sheldon sighed, before opening his eyes.
Gentlemen, Luigi has returned.
Once again, the council table was plunged into silence, until it was finally broken by a green-shelled Koopa.
Wait. Who? Gee. Green Statch?
Paraplunk exclaimed, paling a bit.
Yes, Luigi, the Mario brother.
Sheldon shouted, banging his fist down on the table. He was sweating now.
Some of you might underestimate him, some of you might not even remember him, but you all forget that he was nearly his brother's equal. If even one of the Mario brothers is alive, it puts the whole empire at risk. Forget Prince Ludwig. Luigi is just as dangerous. What say you about this, General Flame?
The Fire Bro, quite frankly, looked as if he was about to be sick.
I am ashamed this happened without me noticing,
he said, sitting down very awkwardly.
With your permission, Grand General, I will take a fleet of ships and launch a full strike on Luigi. We will kill him for real this time, I promise. Even the war effort can spare some troops if a Mario brother is involved.
Sheldon nodded.
I am disappointed, Flame. The Koopa Empire needs to be at its strongest right now. Snuff out Luigi and his allies. We cannot afford a second enemy with the civil war at its height.
The Koopa cruiser moved through the stormy night. Lightning flashed, reflecting off its wet blue hull. Cobal sat on his seat, staring out of the circular window. The Koopa cruisers, as carriers and transport crafts, had several of these seats placed throughout them which were not present when the ships had been designed as King Bowser's private craft. Cobal watched the rain drip down the glass window, lost in thought. Strike sat next to him, as still as a statue. If he made one wrong move, the corporal would be on him in an instant. What a strange situation he was in, Cobal reflected as he stared out at the black clouds. In a way, he was free of the Koopa troop for the first time since he had been captured in Mushroom City, but on the other hand he was even more of a prisoner now. His plans, maybe even his life, all depended on Strike, and the Fire Bro seemed both dangerous and unpredictable. What would Strike let him get away with? Would he sell him out if he tried to take down a Koopa troop base? Or was the cold Koopa really serious about wanting the Empire to fall? He shook his head as lightning flashed through the air. What would Luigi do in this situation? The Koopa cruiser deployed its landing gear, skidding against the Isle Delfino runway with a huge splash of water. They had arrived at Isle Delfino with little to no difficulty. Now, supposedly, Cobal was free to carry out his goals against a division of the Koopa troop that Strike disliked. At least, if what the scarred Fire Bro had said was to be believed.
Time to go,
Strike said gruffly. Cobal walked down the stairs leading down from the Koopa cruiser and began to make his way down the Delfino airstrip, Strike right behind him. The sounds of the ocean waves were all around him, and the rain hit hard upon Cobal's head. He shuddered from the cold. The Mushroom Kingdom didn't get storms as bad as this often. Cobal glanced over the ocean. In the sky he could faintly see the lights of the battleships that surrounded Isle Delfino. As the hub of Sector 3 authority, Isle Delfino was nearly impenetrable, impossible to gain access to forcefully without a long siege. The blockade had allowed the Koopa cruiser to pass by without much trouble though, owing to the fact that Strike was a registered corporal. Perhaps he ought to be thankful, Cobal thought. It would have been extremely hard for anyone to get to the island without this series of events. Best make do with what life had given him. The Koopas had built a bridge from the airstrip leading towards Delfino Plaza. Cobal walked down the road towards the city, which was shining bright in the dark storm. Their walk was silent except for the constant crashing of the waves and pattering of the rain. Cobal was constantly aware of Strike's eyes on his back, and felt himself shudder. For a former resort town and current capital of Sector 3, Isle Delfino seemed strangely deserted. As Cobal walked down the streets towards the town square, he saw only a few people, who all appeared to be Koopa troop members. It seemed most of the people were waiting the storm out in their houses, something which Cobal sorely wished he could be doing right now. But comfort could come later. It was time to deal with this issue. Cobal finally stopped. The Shine Gate loomed over them, draped in the flags of the Koopa Empire. The flags were pink in color and the Koopa they depicted had a more rounded, feminine face and a large bow on her head. High up above the town, Cobal could see Corona Mountain, with a large palace with many towers silhouetted against the night. That had to be Princess Wendy's palace, he realized. It was odd that he was so close to one of the Emperor's children. If he could take her out, he'd take a massive step to freeing the people of Isle Delfino and the surrounding islands. But that would be impossible with just him, right? Cobal turned to Strike.
"What's the plan?"
he asked. The street was currently empty, and they were bathed in the golden glow of the street lamps.
"We're in the capital of Sector 3 with no place to stay and no clear goal."
Strike shrugged.
"Surprise me,"
he said.
"I brought you here to see your conviction. Prove to me you have what it takes to make a better world, Cobal. If you don't, I'm sure the garrison here would be happy to throw a rebel into the prison."
Cobal sighed. All right. So this was going to be difficult. He couldn't trust Strike to help him in whatever plans he had, so he might as well consider himself alone. So, what to do? He glanced up at Wendy's palace again. He wanted to go rushing up the mountain and smash into it right now, but honestly, that was terrible. No way he could overcome hundreds of the Princess elite guards. So what was his next bet? Cobal closed his eyes, trying to ignore the wet raindrops falling on his head. Luigi liked to take things slow. In Toadbert's stories he had been the more strategic brother, the one who had stopped Mario from running into dozens of Bowser's traps blindly. Cobal couldn't afford to give in to his fighter instinct when he had nobody watching his back. He had to be like Luigi.
"We need to find more information,"
Cobal decided, opening his eyes and looking at Strike.
"We're going to the bar." "If that's what you say,"
Strike replied simply. Delfino Plaza seemed to have quite the large amount of taverns. The problem with them seemed to be that they were all full of Koopa troop officers. If Cobal wanted to learn information that would expose weaknesses in the Koopa troops' armor, it was best he'd do it in a place that the Koopas would not notice. The problem was that as the location of Sector 3's main Imperial headquarters, that was difficult to do. He was going to have to visit some pretty shady places, although thankfully, as one of Toad Town's bad boys, he knew a thing or two about that. Cobal turned a bend next to a near overflowing canal and entered a dark alleyway. Clotheslines hung overhead, swaying in the wind, and the alley was nearly pitch black except for a thin beam of light coming from a single doorway. Next to the doorway was a faded sign with the words "Big Boo Bar." Cobal sighed with relief. A place like this, out of every establishment in Delfino Plaza, was likely to have what he wanted. The inside of the Big Boo Bar was a dark room, packed with unsavory-looking people, and dimly lit with low ceilings. A scrawny pianta with pale orange skin tended the bar, his head covered in scars. The people sitting at the seats were mainly piantas and nokis, although there was a scattering of toads, koopas, and goombas as well. Cobal swept his eyes over the people, trying to locate somebody he thought could help. A disgraced former officer, perhaps. Behind him, Strike stood, stoic and threatening, giving dark looks to anybody who glanced their way. There was one person in the bar who stood out to Cobal, simply because of how outlandish he looked. He was a Kremling, first of all, and an incredibly large one. As Cobal had never seen a Kremling before, that was enough to make him stare, but the Kremling was an especially strange-looking one. First of all, he wore a red cape with a diamond brooch and a tall gold crown. Something about the Kremling reminded Cobal of a story Toad Bird had told him, although he didn't remember the details. Didn't Donkey Kong have dealings with a Kremling who looked just like this? Somehow, although he wasn't sure if it was a good idea, Cobal decided to talk to the Kremling. Maybe he was just a crazy person with strange fashion sense who would have no idea how to bring down the Koopa troop, but Cobal felt he needed to indulge the sense of curiosity he felt. Cobal walked over the creaking floorboards and sat down in front of the Kremling.
"Hey there,"
he said, feeling somewhat intimidated in the large reptilian's presence.
"You remind me of a guy I heard about."
The Kremling looked up from his huge mug of strong-smelling green liquid and glared at Cobal. Cobal noticed his right eye was large and bloodshot.
"Are you trying to make fun of me, Yoshi?"
the Kremling hissed.
"Nah, that's not worth my time,"
Cobal replied.
"I've heard stories about a guy who looks just like you. I was wondering."
"Stories?" the Kremling scoffed, picking up his mug and taking an especially large glug of whatever was inside of it.
"They aren't stories, kid, they are facts."
He grinned, baring his pointed, yellow teeth.
"Facts about me. I'm the King K. Rool, baby."
He took another huge drink from his mug, before slamming it down on the table so hard that the table cracked. Cobal noted the Kremling's breath was incredibly bad.
"You mean you're really the same King K. Rool who fought Donkey Kong?"
Cobal asked skeptically.
"How is that?" "Oh, please."
K. Rool sneered.
"Do you think an imposter could reach my level of physique?"
He pounded his belly with his clawed hands. Cobal looked hard at King K. Rool, and thought back to everything he knew about him. The King K. Rool he had heard about had been a tyrant, commanding a huge organization known as the Kremling Crew, which had launched attack after attack on Donkey Kong Island. He had been nearly as persistent in his efforts as Bowser himself. What was he doing here? Had he simply retired from active villainy? Cobal glanced behind him. Strike was watching, his arms crossed. He looked back at K. Rool, who was staring at him with an expression of annoyance.
"Okay, so you're the real deal,"
Cobal said, staring at the Kremling's red eyes.
"So why are you drinking in a dingy tavern on Isle Delfino instead of leading your army?"
King K. Rool suddenly shot forward with the speed of a snake, until his face was an inch away from Cobal's.
"Because that blasted Bowser decided that the world didn't need 2 reptilian warlords,"
K. Rool hissed.
"I barely escaped with my life. I lost everything." The Kremlin crew is gone. My ambitions are gone. Now all I have left are the remnants of the Kremlin fortune, which are enough to buy me enough swamp beer to last of a lifetime.
He leaned back on his seat, and gestured to a dry bones waiter.
Fill this up,
he said, shoving his empty mug in the undead Koopa's face. The dry bones took it and scurried away to the bar. The situation struck Cobal as somewhat sad, almost like the situation Luigi had been in when he had met him. Toadbert's stories had not painted K. Rool in a very favorable light, and normally he'd be glad to see the former tyrant brought down from glory, but seeing him in this pathetic, destitute state just didn't seem right. He had been proud once, but the Koopa Empire had destroyed all of that just like they had so many other things.
Sounds like an awful life for a king,
Cobal commented, raising an eyebrow.
You still call yourself King K. Rool, yet you don't even try to regain your throne. You were tough enough to get back up again countless times after Donkey Kong beat you down. The way I see it, the Kremlin crew isn't dead until you say it is, King K. Rool.
K. Rool laughed hollowly.
You're a bold kid, coming up to the great King K. Rool and trying to get him to change his life. Look at me, boy. I was always the second-rate Bowser anyway. Eventually Donkey Kong got so busy dealing with Tiki-Tak tribes and snowmats he just about forgot me. Just when I had finally got together every bit of the Kremlin crew for my biggest plan yet, the old plumber in the Mushroom Kingdom bites the dust and the Koopas go psycho. 1 week and it was all gone. Just me, the Flying Croc and its crew. Eventually most of them left. Now it's just me, and those buffoons Clump and Crusha.
He jabbed a finger at Cobal, sneering.
Let me get this straight to you, Yoshi boy. There ain't no room for a king in a world with only one kingdom. Look at that guy.
He swept his arm over to a table to his right, where a green-skinned, blond man in a faded cape and white uniform slouched, a mug in his hand.
That bloke over there should be Peasley III, king of the Bean Kingdom, since his old woman got offed in the war. But the only problem is there isn't any Bean Kingdom anymore. There's no Kremlin crew. There's only the Koopa Empire, kid, and there's nothing even the stars can do about it.
Cobal glanced at the man. Peasley? Prince Peasley? He had been the Bean Kingdom's greatest hero, who had helped the Mario brothers against the evil witch Cacletta. Cobal had always assumed he had died. But he was really alive and hiding away all this time? Before Cobal could do anything, Strike had moved forward, slamming his hands on the table in front of Peasley with so much force the table shook.
What do you have to say about yourself, Bean Prince?
Strike shouted. Everybody in the small bar turned to stare at the two. Cobal was shocked. Strike had never showed this much emotion before. King K. Rool sneered, baring his teeth.
This'll be good.
He chuckled. Prince Peasley looked up to meet Strike's gaze. He said in a tired voice.
You're a murderer.
Strike hissed in a venomous voice.
You Bean Kingdom idiots like to think of yourselves as the good guys, don't you? Explain why you wiped out Grand General Spineblast's fleet. 8,000 loyal soldiers, Bean trash. What's heroic in that?
Peasley sighed.
I'm done,
he said weakly.
Kill me if you want to. The Bean Kingdom died with your fleet. I'm not the prince anymore. Do it. I'm not worth anything.
Cobal watched with wide eyes. He had heard of the terrible events that had happened to the Bean Kingdom in the first days of the war. It had been the single most destructive part of Bowser's world domination campaign. At first the Beanish had used the Bean Star to protect their nation from Koopa invasion. It had stayed safe for an entire year, until the Koopa troop had sacked the Sticker Star and obtained the Sticker Comet. The event that had happened was cataclysmic. A gigantic armada of airships, led by the Grand General himself, hovered over the Bean Kingdom as a wish was made on the sticker star to dispel the Beanstar's barrier, a barrier that had been created by a wish for the Bean Kingdom to be protected from all harm. This contradiction of two wishes created a gigantic explosion that wiped out not only the entire fleet, but destroyed Bean Castle town and miles around it, claiming the lives of Grand General Spine Blast of the Koopa Troop, Queen Bean and Lady Lima of the Bean Kingdom, and thousands of others on both sides.
My father died that day.
Strike's voice was almost a whisper, dripping with threat. His face was cold and emotionless.
He was a loyal soldier who wanted nothing more than to do his duty to his nation. You could have stood and fought. You could have used the Bean in a million different ways. But because of what you did, he and countless other mothers and fathers, daughters and sons, died. You.
Suddenly Peasley was up on his feet, his long rapier pointed at Strike's throat. Despite the former prince's disheveled look, the sword looked polished to perfection.
Don't you dare say that!
He screamed in a hoarse voice, the eyes of everyone in the bar on him. All conversation had ceased, even the bartender was watching as if it were some kind of show.
My mother died, you Koopa trash! Don't you dare say it was our fault! None of us knew what would happen if two wishes collide. None of us even thought that you would obtain a wish yourself. Perhaps if you had no tried so hard to crush my nation, you...
Strike's hands burst into flame as his eyes grew hard.
Shut your mouth, beanish scum!
He exclaimed.
I may be a failure, a pathetic waste of space,
Peasley shouted,
but I will not let you slander the honor of the Beanish people by accusing them of the same war crimes that you yourself are guilty of. Drop your sword!
Strike said coolly. K. Rool chuckled wickedly beside Cobal.
I haven't seen something so good since Toad Force V!
He exclaimed. Cobal knew he had to do something. Strike and Peasley were going to fight. That couldn't happen. Peasley was a broken man, but he didn't have to stay that way. And if Strike was going to act like this, he'd land himself in trouble and could kiss his dreams of creating a more honorable Koopa Troop goodbye. It was time to step in.
Stop!
He exclaimed, striding towards them. Peasley and Strike stopped their arguing and turned to look at him.
Look, both of you. War's awful, it's time to just accept that. Way I hear it, it wasn't the Koopas or the Beanish's fault. Just a quirk of wish magic that nobody knew about because it had never happened before. You wanna get back at somebody? Get back at Bowser, he made the war to begin with.
He turned to K. Rool.
That goes for you too, King K. Rool. I thought that almighty king of Crocodile Isle was more than a drunk lazy slob. Well, naturally I am.
K. Rool replied, standing up and walking towards Cobal.
Prove it.
Cobal replied, glaring at K. Rool before turning back to Peasley and Strike.
Peasley, you're going to help us whether you want to or not. K. Rool, stick with us and you'll prove you're more than
second-rate Bowser
like you said you were. Tell me everything you know about Isle Delfino. Then we'll use it against them.
Peasley was silent. Cobal could tell by the look in his black eyes that he was judging him. It was King K. Rool who spoke up.
There are things happening around here, all right,
he said, crossing his arms.
I dunno what to think about them, but supposedly Koopa ships are disappearing like they're being picked off by a ghost or something. Funny thing about that is I heard members of the Goombino Mafia discussing how their partners are
taking care of the Koopas.
Apparently the Goombinos have made a deal trading flight stones to some big shot group calling themselves
7 Stars.
Is it connected? Maybe, but an old croc like me can't be bothered by it.
Cobal thought hard about what K. Rool had said. Koopa ships being picked off mysteriously? That sounded promising. Could there possibly be an anti-Empire group with the resources to do this? Then again, if 7 Stars was part of organized crime, it was unlikely to be an ally, but it was still worth checking out.
Thanks, K-Rool.
Cobal nodded, before looking back at Strike and Peasley. Those two were going to be difficult. It would be easier to do this without them. Who would have thought King K-Rool would have been the easiest to work with, but a former hero like Prince Peasley just couldn't be abandoned like this, and as much as he'd like to be free of him, if he escaped, Strike the Koopa would report his treachery to the Koopa troop.
Come on, guys.
He sighed, gesturing for them to stand up.
You wanna stop Emperor Bowser or not?